I want to speak to you about church polity, and I want to offer some perspectives on church polity. Now, when we use that word polity, we are talking about the way that a church is structured, how it is governed, where does the authority lie, how does the church make decisions. Now, there are three primary ways that churches have structured their polity. One of them is called Episcopal. It's based on the biblical word episkopos and has the idea of oversight or overseer. Now, there are a variety of Christian expressions that have this form of government. Some of these adherents would be Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Episcopal, Lutheran, and Methodist. Now, authority lies in those churches and those systems of church polity with the bishop. Now, for biblical support, people who subscribe to an Episcopal form of government would cite scriptures like Acts chapter 6 and verse 6, Acts chapter 14 and verse 23. They would also cite Acts chapter 20 and verse 28, and Galatians chapter 1 verse 19, and chapter 2 in Galatians verse 9. So it's the general idea of overseer or bishop. The next form of church government is Presbyterian, and this is the rule of elders. So whereas the Episcopal form of government the authority is centered in the bishop, in the Presbyterian form it is centered in the elders. Now, not surprisingly, the Presbyterian church is structured with a Presbyterian polity. Also, Reformed churches of many expressions. The biblical base that is often cited for the rule of elders is Acts 20 and verse 17, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 17, and Titus 1 and verse 15. So the elders in the New Testament churches, there often was a plurality, and these scriptures speak to that. So Episcopal, Presbyterian, and then the other form of government is the form we call congregational. Congregational churches would use this form of government: Baptist, Mennonite, and Evangelical Free. In the congregational form of government, every church is autonomous, and there has been a strong resistance to any kind of hierarchical type of system. And the authority in the congregational church, as it sounds, is in the congregation itself. There are scriptures that support this basis for church government: Acts 15:12, the Jerusalem Council, and also in that chapter verses 22 to 25. Colossians 1:18 that speaks of the body of Christ, and there are many other passages that speak of the entire body of Christ serving together. 1 Peter 2:9, which addresses believers as priests, is also scriptural basis for congregational form of government. Now, most evangelical churches are congregational, at least at some points. However, Baptists from the very beginning have been predominantly congregational in church polity. The Baptist Church has officially and historically recognized two offices in the church, that of pastors and deacons. And while levels of between churches vary of how churches are organized, authority in the Baptist Church lies with the congregation. The Baptist identity as congregational is mainly due to our biblical understanding of the priesthood of the believer and the nature of salvation, as well as our history of separatism and independence in response to hierarchical systems or top-down systems of church government. Whereas Baptists and Congregationalists are sort of grassroots from the bottom up. Now, in today's church climate, especially among Baptists, we are seeing a convergence of the Presbyterian and Congregational models of church government. And it is becoming more common for churches to have a plurality of elders with more limited congregational involvement than perhaps in previous generations. Now, the question has intrigued me for some time: how did we as Baptists so radically change our views of church government, especially in Southern Baptist life? Now, I would like to share a few perspectives on that, and this is strictly my perspective, my observations using anecdotal evidence, and it's not really substantiated by any research, but here's some personal observations of serving as a pastor in a Southern Baptist church for really over 30 years now. So here's a couple thoughts on that. One, in the early 1990s, I would say, some pastors became increasingly at odds over the local church leadership authority that resided often in the deacon body rather than in the office of the pastor. This, in my opinion, seemed to coincide with the introduction and explosion of new music and other changes that were being introduced into the church. For example, that's about the time casual attire became in vogue, questioning why we have Sunday night services, etc. Now, when conflicts occurred over the implementation of changes in the church, that's when there were many conflicts between pastors and the leadership of the church. Now, there's a long history of why deacons in some churches have taken on many administrative matters. One of them is very practical, that typically pastors come and go, but the deacons are those stalwarts that are there in the church. They're highly respected by the congregation, and it's natural that through the years and generations they have assumed quite a bit of authority in the church. Now, these skirmishes between pastors and established church leaders over changes being made often led to the termination of pastors. And when this occurred, the terminated pastors often began anew in churches where elders were established and deacons were conspicuously absent, or their role was redefined. So that's one thought. There's also been an undeniable and unmistakable shift towards Reformed theology in the SBC, something that was unheard of 3 decades ago. Many SBC leaders are Reformed in doctrine. Many leading congregations have elder boards, and popular preachers and writers are often identified as having Reformed views. Think of the theological influence of such men in the SBC, for instance, as John Piper, or J.I. Packer, R.C. Sproul, Mark Deaver, Al Mohler, president of Southern Seminary, Timothy Keller, John MacArthur, Wayne Grudem and his systematic theology that is used extensively in SBC life, Timothy George at Beeson Divinity, and countless others, all Reformed in their theological stance. Think also of the influence of various parachurch movements, the 9 Marks movement, the Gospel Coalition, both renewal movements heavily based on Reformed theology. Many of these pastors, academics, and organizations associated with these leaders are promoted and studied in Southern Baptist seminaries. So that has a lot to do with the shift as well. And then finally, a good deal of literature is being published by Reformed persons today that advocates the plurality of elders as the norm in churches. So I think we're seeing this convergence of Congregational and Presbyterian forms of government primarily for these 3 reasons. Now, let me offer just a couple thoughts on navigating forward on this. Not always, but sometimes elders are preferred by some pastors due to the fear that congregational involvement may slow down the work of God, and it allows the unspiritual or immature believers to perhaps have too much authority. This is certainly a danger in the congregational form of government. Sometimes it can become bureaucratic and a slowed process. Sometimes not everyone is at the same level spiritually in their maturity with Christ. And so this sometimes has frustrated pastors in the past from implementing their vision. And so some pastors fear that a congregational form of government might hinder the work of God. However, I personally would not recommend wholesale changing an existing church from the traditional structure of recognizing pastors and deacons, along with congregational involvement, to a system of elders with a limited congregational involvement. That would be my caution. If you feel that your current church should consider having elders, I would ask the following questions. What is particularly problematic in your current situation? Are there perhaps some fears that the congregational involvement in the process of making decisions is hindering the vision of the church? Is there a problem with decision making in the church that could be solved perhaps through education rather than an entirely new system? Does the church have an adequate understanding of the offices of pastors and deacons? Often this is lacking in the local church. Simply having a board of elders may not necessarily solve your current problems and could actually cause more. So I would walk carefully in this area. Second, I would say deacons could and historically have done some of the administrative functions that elders may be taking on in the churches that have a current system of elders. So you perhaps have already people in place that are carrying out some of these administrative functions or could be nurtured and trained to do some of these. If you're in a multiple staff church, as I am, often they will act as a sort of unofficial board of elders handling the day-to-day administrative affairs of the church that an elder board may be charged to do. And so if you're in a multiple staff, often the board of elders might be a ministry ruling elders rather than an administrative board. Another possibility for handling church administration and other policy issues, which is often the primary role of a group of elders, could be to use what has traditionally been called the church council or advisory council. This typically is a group of key leaders in the church and usually involves staff members along with key committee leaders in the areas of deacons, stewardship, personnel, and trustees. A group of this makeup could be charged with administrative responsibilities that would essentially operate in a similar way to a board of elders without using that terminology. So you may want to consider that. Many medium-sized churches will have a church council, an advisory council that is primarily used for planning, but that is often a great group to vet policy changes through and also to make some administrative actions in your church. So take that in consideration. Walk carefully as you make changes to polity in your church. Learn how your church functions. Find out why they do what they do, and be cautious in making those changes, and have a system in place that will best move forward the vision that God has given you as the shepherd and the pastor of that church. God bless you.